The Grand Mosque of Paris. A story of how Muslims rescued Jews during the Holocaust. In 1940, war came to Paris, and life was turned upside down. Nazis in heavy boots tramped the streets. People waited in long lines for hours just to buy a small loaf of bread. And policemen arrested whole families for the crime of being Jewish. During the war, fear, hunger, and loss became everyday companions. Danger was everywhere, especially for Jews, including Jewish children. Germany's Nazis, who had started the war, hated Jews and were determined to hunt them down. Nazi soldiers invaded Poland in 1939, and World War II began, spreading the Nazi regime across Europe. Many Jews fled to France, where they hoped they would be safe. Then, in 1940, the Nazis conquered France. A new French government of collaborators was set up in the city of Vichy. The Vichy government, working hand in hand with the Nazis, immediately began to pass anti-Jewish laws. The Vichy police arrested Jews and crowded them into filthy vermin-infested internment camps. But a plan of truly unimaginable horror was looming. In 1942, the Nazis set up death camps and began the mass murder of Europe's Jews. The Vichy government rounded up Jews of all ages and sent them to the death camps. In France, 11,402 Jewish children, toddlers, and even tiny babies were deported to death camps. Only about 300 of them survived the war. Throughout France, some people tried to protect Jewish children, hiding them in convents and schools, on farms, and at hospitals. Anywhere a Jewish child might be able to blend in. But in Paris, Nazis and police were everywhere, and it was much harder to hide. For the first 2 years of the occupation, the southern part of France was surrounded by Vichy rather than the Nazis. It was controlled by Vichy rather than the Nazis. In spite of the Vichy police, the southern zone was still a safer place for Jews than the Nazi-occupied northern zone. Many Jewish families attempted to make the perilous trip south. Some Jews in Paris found help in an extraordinary place. It was the Grand Mosque, the center of the Islamic community in France, an oasis hidden behind high walls right in the middle of the city. The Grand Mosque shimmered like a mirage. The white domes and glittering mosaics of the minaret in stark contrast to the muted colors of Paris. When the mosque was built in 1926, the North African countries of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia were under French rule, and many Muslims had come to Paris from these countries. The land for the mosque was given by the French government in exchange for a symbolic payment of 1 franc to thank the 500,000 Muslim soldiers who had fought for France during the First World War. Expert craftsmen who were brought over from North Africa created the mosque's intricate carvings and richly patterned mosaics. Graceful columns and arches surrounded courtyards and gardens filled with flowers, trees, and cascading fountains. The song of birds was everywhere. From the top of the minaret, the voice of the muezzin could be heard across the neighborhood, calling the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. But the mosque was not only a place to pray. It was created as a true community center. Everything that happened in its Muslim community was recorded at the mosque, including births, marriages, and deaths. Adults and children studied there and could consult the many precious manuscripts and books in the library. On alternating days, men or women could relax in the steam bath of the hammam. Children could play in the gardens. Adults could stroll along the tiled walkways or shop in the souk. And all were welcome for mint tea and sweet North African pastries in the mosque's restaurant. Any Muslim in need could find help at the mosque. There was even a clinic within the mosque's grounds and a hospital in the suburbs for those who were seriously ill, with an Islamic cemetery nearby. The man at the heart of the mosque was its rector, Si Kadur Benhabrit. As rector, he was in charge of running the mosque, while the imam was the spiritual leader. A sophisticated and cultured Algerian-born diplomat, Si Benhabrit wrote plays and books and loved music. He had been an important official in Morocco and had worked closely with many French diplomats. Si Benhabrit was equally comfortable in Paris and in North Africa. He was the perfect choice to be the mosque's first rector. Si Benhabrit was the most powerful Muslim in France, and the French government looked to him to speak for the entire Muslim community. Then France fell to the Nazis. In September 1940, just 3 months later, the Nazis and the Vichy government already suspected that the people of the mosque were helping Jews. This put the mosque's rector and his staff in great peril, but it didn't stop them. Salim Halali, a young Berber Jew from Algeria, was trapped in Paris during the occupation. He had come to the city when he was 14 to fulfill his dream of becoming a singer. Now, in grave danger, he came to the mosque. Si Benhabrit made a certificate of conversion to show the Nazis, proving that Salim's grandfather had converted to Islam. The rector even had a stone carver secretly inscribe the family name on an unmarked tombstone in the Muslim cemetery, hoping to convince the Nazis that Salim was actually a Muslim. Jewish or Muslim, the people of North Africa lived as neighbors and shared similar cultures. Through the centuries, they referred to each other as brothers. They also looked very much alike. That is why Salim was able to live safely in the mosque for the rest of the war, pretending to be Muslim. Two friends from North Africa escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Germany. and made their way to Paris. Albert Assouline, a Jew, and Yasser Rahal, a Muslim, had no identity papers and were certain to be arrested if caught. Because Albert was Jewish, the risk for him was even greater. The two men had to stay hidden and tried to find refuge in a place of worship. "We ruled out the synagogue," said Albert. "The church didn't seem safe either. So we ended up at the door of the Grand Mosque of Paris." He went in first, leaving me outside, and asked if he could bring a friend in who was not a Muslim, and they said yes. So he came back out for me, and we stayed for 2 or 3 days. While he was there, Albert saw other people in hiding. He said the adults were in the basement, and the children were in apartments upstairs. Si Kadur Benhabrit had a large family, and they were sheltering children. And in the other apartments there were children too, who could have been Jewish or not. Besides all the public rooms of the mosque, there were the apartments for the people who worked there. The rector, the imam, the muezzin, the custodian, and others. Many of them had families and could hide North African Jewish children in among their own. Nobody would notice the difference, and even if they did, the mosque could provide false Muslim birth certificates. It would be nearly impossible for anyone to check their authenticity because records in North Africa were too disorganized. However, only people who were Muslims or who could pass as North African Muslims could stay at the mosque for more than a few days. Most others had to be guided out of Paris fairly quickly. It would be too difficult to keep them hidden from the Nazis. Nazis and Vichy officials treated the mosque with respect, but they could come in and investigate at the slightest suspicion that anyone might be hiding there. Fortunately, there was an alarm system. Sitting in his office, Si Benhabrit could discreetly press a button on the floor under his desk that set off the alarm in another part of the mosque. Once warned, the people in hiding rushed into the secluded women's section of the prayer room, where even Nazis and Vichy police dared not enter. The rector delayed the search by demanding that the soldiers and police remove their boots. Before going into the prayer room of any mosque, it is customary to remove all footwear. Taking off heavy military boots took time, giving everyone the opportunity to get out of sight. The Nazis were reluctant to target Muslims. They feared a Muslim uprising in North Africa, where they were already fighting the Allies. Even so, as Albert wrote, there were some close calls, like the day when the Germans were astonished to smell tobacco at the mosque, even though they knew Muslims were forbidden by their religion to smoke. Dr. Ahmed Somia, a Muslim from Tunisia, tried to protect children at risk of Nazi arrest. He pretended that they were ill and sent them to special clinics away from Paris, where they would be safe until the war ended. Sometimes he was able to give them false identity papers. This would disguise a Jewish child as a Christian or a Muslim. At the Muslim hospital where Dr. Somia worked, doctors secretly treated injured Allied pilots and parachutists at night and hid them during the day. Some of these men had come to France as spies Others had been shot down by Nazis while flying missions over France. They were behind enemy lines and they needed help. During the war, Dr. Somia said, we formed a group to aid North African prisoners of war who had escaped. We were there to help anyone who was persecuted or hunted, who needed a place to hide, and we could direct them to the mosque, especially, which was always open to them. There were many who followed that route and found shelter at the mosque. One person who needed shelter was a Tunisian Jew. He came to Paris on business and then disappeared. Nobody knew what had happened to him, and his family feared he was dead. 2.5 years later, after the end of the war, he returned home at last. He said that he had been hiding from the Nazis and had found shelter at the mosque. He was living there all that time and told his boss that he spent his days improving his Arabic. By the time of the Nazi occupation, nearly all of Paris's Muslims were Kabyles, Berbers from Kabylia, up in the high and forbidding Atlas Mountains of Algeria. After France lost many young men in the First World War, workers from Kabylia came to take their places in the factories and on construction sites. In fact, Kabyle laborers built the Paris subways. These men sent their earnings to the families they had to leave behind in Algeria and returned to visit them when they could. Between the two world wars, Kabyle Muslims became part of the fabric of France. In the summer of 1942, arrests of Jews in France escalated. The largest roundup of all occurred in Paris in July, when the Vichy police arrested almost 13,000 Jews at once. A letter was recently found among the old papers of a Paris cafe owned by a Tunisian. This letter was written in Kabyle, the language of the Kabyles, and the cafe owner said that it dated from World War II, and it read, "Yesterday at dawn, the Jews of Paris were arrested, the elderly, the women, and the children. In exile like ourselves, workers like ourselves, they are our brothers. Their children are like our own children. Anyone who encounters one of his children must give that child shelter and protection for as long as misfortune or sorrow lasts. O men of my country, your heart is generous." Was this letter read out in the cafe? Did it circulate among the Kabyle workers of Paris, making its way through the crowded boarding houses or where these men lived? It certainly seems to be a call to action. Without a doubt, it is a recognition of the strong bond between North African Muslims and Jews. Many Muslims in the French resistance were involved in helping Jews escape from Nazi-occupied Paris. The resistance was a clandestine network of spies and fighters made up of ordinary people, perhaps teachers, bakers, journalists, or factory workers, who did whatever they could to fight the Nazis. The Kabyles who fought in the French resistance had two advantages. The first was their language. Nobody but Kabyles spoke or understood it. They were able to form a tight network and use Kabyle as a kind of code. Dr. Somia said, "You could confide a secret to a Kabyle and rest absolutely assured that it would not be betrayed." The second advantage was the fact that the Kabyles were Muslim. When they wore the traditional tasseled wool felt hat called a chacheya or a fez, it signaled that they were Muslim, and so they were less likely to be stopped by the Nazis. This also made the Chechaya a perfect disguise for some Jews. Kabyles operated a secret network that smuggled people out of Paris to safety, and they also carried coded messages between the resistance in France and the Free French Army in Algeria. Their smuggling network was initially devised to aid escaped prisoners of war and Allied pilots and parachutists in hiding. However, as the war went on, the Kabyles began to smuggle more and more Jewish men, women, and children away from danger. One route they used to help people escape the Nazis involved the mosque. They would sneak people into the mosque right before curfew, when the police were distracted by their dinner. A story describes a delivery man and his vehicle, a three-wheeled bicycle, with a large bin attached to it. There was just enough space inside the bin to hide someone. As long as nobody looked inside, that hidden person might be safe. The delivery man could pedal to the mosque through the streets of Paris, right under the noses of the police. There were other ways to slip people into the mosque. Albert said, you could enter through secret doors into the basement, the hammam, or through the mosque's restaurant. Once they had been smuggled into the mosque, people usually didn't stay for long. In the sub-basement of the mosque, there was a cramped stairway leading down into a maze of tunnels. Centuries before, as Paris was built, stone was quarried beneath the city to construct its magnificent buildings. This left behind a souterrain, a subterranean tangle of interconnecting tunnels, rooms, and passageways, eventually including an underground river and burial chambers called the catacombs. The ceilings of the souterrain's passageways were low. In some places, a person would have to crouch down or even crawl to get through. Rough steps led down to deeper levels, and there were holes that could swallow an unwary traveler. Hundreds of miles of utterly dark, chilly passageways twisted and turned beneath the streets. If you knew the route, you could travel underground from the mosque to the bank of the river Seine. And if you didn't know the way, you could become hopelessly lost in the souterrain. The Kabyle resistance guided people through the black labyrinth of the souterrain, from the mosque to the bank of the Seine near the Halles aux Vins, a huge central wine market. Wine was delivered here in massive wooden barrels from all over France, and the barrels were transported on long péniches, barges, and returned empty. These péniches were used by the Kabyle resistance to carry their coded messages. Among the empty wine barrels on board, they hid people, Allied pilots and parachutists, escaped prisoners of war, resistance fighters, and Jews. Gliding out into the current, the péniche would transport their precious cargo, spiriting to safety those who had been sheltered in the Grand Mosque of Paris. Throughout the war, Si Kadour Ben Habrit had to maintain a precarious and dangerous balance. As rector of the mosque, he was obliged to deal with the Nazis and the Vichy government in order to protect the Muslim community in Paris. But during the occupation, he also continued to secretly allow the mosque to be a safe haven for those who needed it. The Allies chased the Nazis out of Paris in September 1944, after 4 long years of occupation. World War II ended the following year. Si Ben Habit continued as rector of the mosque until his death in 1954. His grave lies in the mosque, where he was buried facing in the direction of Mecca, as are all Muslims. Because of Si Ben Habit's actions, the Jewish singer Salim Halali lived a long, successful life and is still revered as the father of modern North African song. Albert Assouline, the Jewish Algerian who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp, joined the Free French Army in Algeria and battled the Nazis until the end of the war. Afterward, he settled in Paris. For the rest of his life, he was dedicated to helping people in need at the Grand Mosque, where his own life had been saved. After the war, the Muslim Tunisian doctor, Ahmed Soumia, continued just as he had always done, saving lives regardless of his patients' politics or beliefs. He almost never spoke of his actions during the occupation. Muslims working in the mosque and in the resistance saved numerous lives, Jewish and non-Jewish, by their selfless acts. They risked their own lives to do what they felt was right. It should never be forgotten that Muslims came to the aid of their brothers and sisters, the Jews. Amid the horror of the Holocaust, something noble and courageous quietly unfolded within the walls of the Grand Mosque of Paris.